sessions. All right. So most of you have been in industry. Some of you are freshers, I understand, but most of you understand the waterfall model of software engineering, right? Yeah. So here we had earlier. Let me just change this to a pen. And here we had learned that there are phases like requirement gathering. Um, okay, you will have to pardon my writing because I'm doing this first time. Then we have design, and there are high level design, low level design, and whatnot. Then we have coding. Then we have testing, and then we have deployment or implementation, whatever you call it, right? So this is basically the software engineering process that we have been following in earlier days. I wouldn't call that recent past, but some companies still follow this process. I don't know why. But this process has been there in software industry for a long, long time. So what happens is in requirement analysis phase or requirement gathering phase, you understand what your stakeholders are going to do or are expecting, then you write it down or do further analysis on that. And after finishing of this phase, you get into designing, whether it is high level design or low level design. Then you get, once the high level, low level design is completed, then you get into coding. And then once the code is completed completely, then you get into testing. And then once the all types of test cases or testing is done, then you deploy product. Now you would say, who does this, right? Nowadays, nobody does this in this sequential fashion with maybe probably 2 months here or 3 months here, or let's say 6 months spending here and then do 3 months testing here and then deploy it, right? So this span of, let's say, more than 14 months, nobody waits this long nowadays. I understand that. But we definitely follow this process from requirement till deployment, even if it is a shorter project of 1 month or more than that. Why is this transition happening, that you guys are doing software development in so rapidly and fast mode? Is because everybody wants to deploy their product into the market faster. So time is the key, the speed is the key. And to do that, nobody can wait for their project to be completed. For example, in this case, we are waiting for 14 months to see that product, whether it is a web application or whether it is a mobile application. Nobody wants to see their product after 14 months. They want to see how it looks like as early as 2 weeks or 1 month, because they want to see whether it is being created in correct way or not. So one thing is, even customers are becoming more and more aware about how the software engineering works and how frequently they should be reviewing their work product, which should be deployable in the market. So this transition from going from a traditional SDLC model to more of an agile or iterative processes has been happening since last 10, 20 years now. But most adopted keyword for that agile methodology is called Scrum. And I'll tell you why Scrum is more famous shortly. But before that, um, let's have a story. So in that story, there is a business analyst, and there is a developer, there is a tester, and there is a deployment engineer, and there is business stakeholder. Okay. So business stakeholder is actually um, at the, there is a river flowing in between. So a business stakeholder is on this side of the river, and he wants his team who is standing here on the other side of the river to come to him. And all of these are the team members. Some are BA, developer, tester. So how would they come to the BA or the business stakeholder? So is biz, right? And this is the team. So if you consider the case of SDLC, you will have smaller boards where the BA would sit in this boat, and he will have his own boat. He will pedal through and come to business. Then there will be architect or designer who will be sitting in another boat, and he will be pedaling to this shore and coming to the boat. Similarly, there will be all other people who will be sitting in their individual boats. So that's how traditional waterfall model worked, where everybody had their own ship to sell, I would say, or a small boat to sell, and they have their own interest that I have to finish my job and then move on to next project. But this is not how software engineering should work, right? Because you cannot have teams working. Team is basically together everyone achieves more. So if you want to develop a software, then all of you should be sitting in that boat together and then pedaling together, right? So BA or developer or tester or deployment engineer, everyone should have their own pedal to actually pedal this boat to business. Business has some objective, which is getting to another shore. And that's what the difference between the traditional model of agile to Scrum and traditional model of waterfall and Scrum and agile. So that was a short story to ensure that you understand what we are looking at. But let's go back to our main agenda, understanding what Scrum is all about. So anyone has any notion of what Scrum is and what are its fundamental principles? Has anybody worked in Scrum Agile model recently? Yes, no, few, anyone? Okay, so Scrum is a very latest development, I would say. The initial Scrum was used in as late as 1993 by Eisenkorb. There are people like Ken Schauber or Mike Biddle. Ken Schauber and Mike John actually co-founded the Scrum Alliance in 2002. And they initially gave some framework or a processes for Scrum, right? And that framework is all about, is called a manifesto, the Agile Manifesto that they call. What they think should happen is, in traditional waterfall models or all other engineering models, we had a lot of processes or tools. So instead of using a lot of processes or tools, they wanted to transition from process to tools to individual interactions. So when you're working as a team, individuals and interactions matter. So these people designed a framework such that they just put the principles in together so that everybody can follow that. Then second is, in a traditional model, you must have seen that there is a lot of documentation, right? You have BRDs, PRDs, I don't know, functional specifications, high-level design, low-level design, test cases were traditionally documented as well. Then you will have defects. Then you will have what? Reports, million types of reports, weekly status report or monthly status report and whatnot, right? So instead of all that documentation, the manifesto focuses on working software. That is more important. So even if you create millions or gazillion sheets of documents, will that matter if you don't have working software? And that was the focus of this Scrum Alliance, or to create a manifesto which had very specific statement of values, which is working software. Then you have, there were a lot of contract negotiations happening in traditional project management. In case the project delays, typically, there are a lot of contract negotiations. For example, Infosys tries to, or is in project with, let's say, a big multinational company who is creating a software, and that 12 months project got derailed by another 2 months or 6 months. In that case, there will be a lot of contract negotiation. So instead of that, these people value customer collaboration. This is another value that they focused on. Then there is something called following a plan, which is basically when you create a project plan. Have you guys seen any traditional project plans? A traditional project plan would have a work breakdown structure, lot of activities, the activity assigned to a particular person, and there are FIFO, LIFO, there are a lot of dependencies from one stage to another stage, and that will be very comprehensive document. And bigger organization would actually hire a project management professionals to actually follow that plan or create that plan. And that was very structured approach of project management. There are also a lot of certifications like PMP. The reason I'm calling out such certifications is because I have done one. I've been doing project management as well as test management or test practice handling as well. So I know the traditional project management, and as I'm also a Scrum Master certified, I also know how Scrum is used as a project management tool. So there was a lot of focus on following plan. So instead of following that rigid, stubborn plan, which will not allow you to go out of your boundaries that you have created for yourself, Scrum and Agile is all about change. It's all about responding to change, actually. So how can you respond to change if customer, let's say, says that tomorrow my requirement itself has changed, then you have to adjust to his requirement. If his priorities are changing from one feature to another feature, then you should be able to adjust your uh, priorities in your project management as well. So that's what this is called Agile Manifesto. So I'll write it down here for everybody's. Okay, so just don't worry about my handwriting too much. Also listen to me, because my handwriting is very pathetic, as you can see. All right, moving on to next topic. So how the Scrum works, what are the stakeholders, what are the people involved in Scrum, and what are the ceremonies and what are the artifacts created is what we will talk about now. So in traditional software development, waterfall lifecycle also, we had a team, right? So what that team comprised of? Can anybody tell me the roles now? Anyone? Okay. Silence is not an answer.
Requirement team, development team.
Okay. So yes, requirement team typically had titles like business, right?
Yeah.
Right. And then we had a lot of developers, right?
Yeah.
So this is dev. Okay. Let's say that
Testing team.
for testing team, let's pick another color maybe. So there is a testing team. Okay. What other roles are there?
Support.
Okay. For support, let's pick another color. Who else?
DevOps team is also.
Okay. DevOps, let's choose another color. Who else?
Project managers.
Yeah, yeah. Project manager, obviously. So let's pick another color for this guy. Yeah, PM. And we have, who was this? DevOps. And then there was support, right? This is QA. So this is team, right? Who creates the product? There is BA as well, who is part of the team, or sometimes there are, I mean, most of the times, there are some people called stakeholders or business stakeholders, right? So business, their role is to give you what? What does business do? एक को हम बोल रहे हैं सबसे important, I mean, customer, right? So all of these people play role into their software development life cycle. Business actually gives us priorities onto what things need to be done, in what order. Um, Customer actually gives us the requirement, right? The real users of the system. Business analyst actually collects requirement from them. Sometimes business has their representatives who knows what their ideas are regarding how the customer will actually use their product. But most of the time, the business tells a business analyst to go to the users or customers and find out the requirements. In agile terminology, these guys are actually called POs, right? Product owners. The product owner actually goes to researches on what are the real needs of solving a specific business problem. For example, there is a resale car market, and where create business has decided to create a website and mobile application for a resale car market for users to go and search for used cars and then buy them online. So that is a problem that they are trying to solve. Then product owner or business analyst tries to understand how that can be done, and he creates detailed requirements, and then he pass it on to development team. So these are the roles that we have, where development team is actually a multifunctional team, right? There are some developers, there are some QAs, some support staff, some DevOps guys, and a project manager. So all of these guys have their own specific skills. Like a developer is skilled in developing the software, QA and test team is skilled in testing the software and whatnot. Sometimes this team is also multi-skilled. Sometimes developer also is asked to test. Most probably in a smaller startup teams, their developer himself tries to do testing because they can't either afford to have a separate testing team, or they want to have their team only test their product and make sure that it is working fine. And then they have DevOps as well, either as a separate function. Most of the enterprise organizations where there are multiple products are being developed at the same time, they have verticals as well, kind of departments. So development folks come from that department. Software engineering department, they call it. QA come from quality engineering department. Support team comes from operational department. DevOps comes from their own DevOps department, or whatever they call it. So these guys are actually divided into their verticals as well sometimes, but they come together as a team for a specific purpose of creating the software or a business value, right? That is what the purpose of the team is. And they should be working very closely together to do that task. Sometimes if the engineering company is not a big enterprise company, it's just a startup, then most of the time they have their team doing that same job, two jobs at the same time. Like, for example, QA doing DevOps job, or dev doing DevOps job, dev doing support job, or one of the developer becomes project manager or a scrum master as well, right? So a multi-talented team which doesn't hesitate from taking on any ownership in that team. Sometimes these are also called T-shaped engineers. Why are they called T-shaped engineers? Because they are having a specific skill in one particular department, for example, development, and they know few things in other as well. For example, DevOps or support, they know these skills as well, right? So that's why they are called T-shaped engineers. And most of the companies now hire T-shaped engineer who can at times do these jobs as well, DevOps jobs or support jobs, but they are specifically skilled in that one particular thing, which is either development or testing. Hence, it is advised for QAs to not, as we are only specifically talking about QAs in these sessions, QAs should adopt some other skills as well. Like, they must know how to deploy or build a software and deploy. Most of them call it either DevOps or CI/CD, right? CI/CD, CT. There are a lot of acronyms nowadays thrown. CI is continuous integration. CD is continuous deployment or delivery. CT is continuous testing. And then there is DevSecOps, which is development, security, and operations coming together as DevSecOps, which is mostly around how to continuously do your security analysis in CI/CD environment. So most of the times it is important for you guys to understand these roles and where do you fit in other than QA. You have to make sure that you are developing skills in that area as well. Okay. Are we clear on what are the roles in Scrum? This PM Buddy is also called as Scrum Master. PM project management is not equal to Scrum Master, because Scrum Master, project manager in traditional setup was responsible for planning, scheduling, monitoring, tracking, and creating a lot of reports, removing impediments. But in Scrum and Agile, it is the Scrum Master's roles and responsibilities are to make sure that the team does not have any impediments. He schedules all the ceremonies or team meetings and facilitates them. And he makes sure that the team is guarded from any, distractions. For example, business tomorrow can come in and tell them that you have to develop this, but Scrum Master can tell them to back off, that team is already motivated to do what you have told them to do about the overall project goal is, or a team goal is. So they are already working on that. If the priorities are changing, they should be changing from the product owner perspective. So he does a lot of that guarding. Product owner is responsible for creating your product backlog, making sure that everything that is coming in there, all the requirements coming in there are being prioritized and detailed out for the team to understand it. We'll get into that little bit later. Everybody understands this, at least roles?
Yes.
Any questions here? Okay. All right, now let's move on to understand what are different ceremonies in the Scrum framework. So I'm sure that most of you might have learned about Scrum earlier as well. So can someone tell me what these ceremonies are? Anyone? None? Ceremonies are meetings. So what are the types of meetings in Scrum?
Sprint planning is one.
Very good. So sprint planning. What do we do in sprint planning?
We plan the current sprint, which will be in perform in upcoming days. So we plan for all the stories and stories from the backlog, which are mostly on there.
Okay. So
In
let's
sprint planning, we
back.
create the story, we discuss the story, and we assign the story.
Correct. So let's talk about two backlogs first. First is your product backlog. Okay. So there is backlog means, let's say, a bucket, right? So product backlog is the backlog created by product owner, which is list of stories. What are stories, by the way?
Stories are the task.
Okay. Stories are a task or something, a feature that needs to be created, which needs to be shipped to production in that sprint itself. Let's say, as a user, and there is some description of that feature, as I need, as a user, what kind of user that is, if it is admin or if it is normal user, I need some feature so that I can achieve something. That is called a user story. This is the format in which the user stories are typically written in. Then you can add more meat to it by adding acceptance criteria, which describes how the story should be tested and accepted. You can also add a lot of images, forms, description of your requirement, and that is called a user story. These user stories are typically managed in professional software like Jira, ClickUp, or Bitbucket. There are a lot of softwares which actually helps you to create that user story. Now, this once product owner creates this user story, he puts that into a product backlog. Okay. Now the product backlog, let's say this user story is user story 01. Now he can prioritize that user story and keep writing these user stories and elaborating them. And that's how it is ordered. And he can also switch the priorities based on what he feels comfortable. Which feature needs to be created first? If you have not created, let's say, login or, in microservices architecture, you need to have a consumer or a provider. So which one you should create first, provider or consumer? Based on that, you can shift your priorities. In this process, most of the times, people like technical architect or a developer or whoever wants to contribute back to architecting and prioritizing can also help product owner prioritize this backlog. Now, what happens is this he does on his own, sometimes with team, but in sprint planning, what needs to happen is the input should be prioritized list of these stories, which is called product backlog. Now let's erase this a little bit so that we have some space here. Okay, so we have this product backlog, and in product backlog, we have list of user stories now. This product backlog is now used in sprint planning. Sprint, what is sprint? Sprint is a specific time of 2 to 4 weeks. Typically, it is 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks as well, depending on what team decides their sprint should be. In this sprint, all the requirements, user stories, or features that you have decided you will work on will be worked on by team, and they will be potentially shippable product. That means that their requirement analysis till deployment, everything should happen in that 2 weeks. So what the team should be making sure is that they have taken up enough work for them in that 2 weeks. Let's say there are 4 developers, and typically for 4 developers, there are 1 or 2 testers, and there is 1 support staff and 1 DevOps team, right? So this is your team. So what they do is they pick up a user story from their product backlog, okay? They size it and put it into their sprint backlog. And here they fill up their sprint with that sizing. Let's say, what is that size, by the way? What does sizing mean or estimation mean? So they pick up a user story and then they see whether all the details in that user story are clear or not. And if they are clear, how much time will they take as a team to deliver that? Typically, estimation happens in several ways. Some of the teams use hour-based estimation mechanism. Some people use story pointing, which is a Fibonacci series of 1, 3, 5, 7, 13, and 21, where the team sizes this story, whether it is going to take us. This sizing also sometimes depend on what they think about the complexity of the user story. If the user story is very simple, can be done in 1 or 2 days, typically 1 is assigned to that. If it is 2 to 3 days, 3 is assigned to that. And every individual has their own opinion about a user story. A developer might say that this is very simple user story, I will assign 1 to it. This is a democratic process. In sprint planning, you pick up a story, review it, and everybody raises their hand. Okay, I'm going to vote it as one story point. Developer says, this is one story point. Tester says, no, this is 5 user story point story, because I think that it is going to take a lot of time for me to test it, even though the code changes are small. So then they negotiate and decide whether it is 5 or 1. There are, most of the times there is, once you have done this sprint planning for several sprints, you understand what the sizing mechanism is for the team. So complexity wise or size wise, team grows in their knowledge of what that sizing would be. So eventually everybody agrees that it is a 5-point story. Then you put that user story 01 into the bucket with 5-point story. Then you size every story that you have picked up so far, and you fill up your bucket with your number of stories. Okay. But then how much can you do in one sprint of 2 weeks? Depends on how much you can get done in 2 weeks. In first sprint, probably you wouldn't know how much you can get done, but eventually you would know that in 2 week sprint, we are creating, let's say, or working for 65 user story points. These are called user story points. So the team synonym says that we can deliver 65 user stories, and this is called their sprint velocity. So team can run and burn these 65 user story points eventually in sprint planning meeting. As soon as your bucket fills around 65 user story points, you stop at that point because you have taken enough work for yourself, right? So in sprint planning meeting, you see what are those user stories that you can pick up for your sprint, in which you will be developing them, testing them, and making them potentially shippable. Now, what if you do not have enough details into that user story? What happens in that case? To solve that problem, there is something called grooming. So in grooming session, all of these requirements in a backlog are groomed with teams so that they can be understood by the full team. So grooming sessions are typically done before the sprint planning sessions, and they are done once or twice in a week to add more meat into the story. If there are some clarifications, if team doesn't know how to develop that specific requirement, then they are clarified in that grooming session. Next ceremony, are we clear here on sprint grooming and planning? Okay, let's talk about next ceremony, which is stand-ups. So what are stand-ups or a daily scrum meeting? What are they?
They are basically divided into 3 points: what we have done yesterday, what we'll do today, and what are the blockers. So it helps in what task we are working upon and if there are any blockers for that story. So basically,
Very good. So this is basically it. What did I do yesterday? what am I going to do today, and are there any impediments? So these are the three questions answered by each and every teammate aligned with sprint goal, right? What did I do yesterday? I was just shopping around the mall is not the answer for that question, right? What were you doing which is aligned to the sprint goal, which you have decided in sprint planning, is something that you have to discuss at that point of time. It's not a status meeting. So people typically do not understand when they're working in a real Scrum environment what they need to talk about. What you have done, have you accomplished anything which is aligned to the sprint goal, is something that needs to be discussed in this meeting. Then what am I going to do today is something that you talk about. What is your plan to do today? Okay. And then are there any impediments? Are you blocked on doing something? For example, I was working yesterday on creating a web service or testing a web service, and I'm blocked for, let's say, post call because I do not know what is the expected result of that post call, something like that, right? So who is responsible? I mean, now the Scrum Master who is facilitating this stand-up meeting needs to ask very specific questions. So whom are you blocked for? Is that some technical architect or developer? And then takes out that discussion from that meeting and then follows with the developer or technical architect to get that information to QA or testing, right? That is what his job is. Then there are, I mean, this meeting is very, brief and small, and that's why typically it is from 10 to 15 minutes, not more than that. And that's why they are called stand-ups. Most of the people are standing in the room. This is very collaborative meeting. But if there are any questions, clarifications, or longer discussion, that should happen out of this 10-15 minutes. When these meeting gets very bigger, typically then it does not really solve the purpose. Okay. Actually, this is not a problem solving meeting. That's why it is done in a separate section. And only team members, Scrum Master, Product Owner can talk. Everybody else, even if they are invited, can keep their mouth shut. And this meeting is the only meeting happens in the day for the team, right? So this is a daily Scrum meeting or a stand-up meeting, which is called. Any questions for this? Next meeting is a sprint review. Anybody has any knowledge of what sprint review meetings are? This is the time to brag about. This is the meeting where you talk about your accomplishments. What have you achieved? This is the time for you to demo what have you done. This is very informal meeting, and it should not take more than 1 or 2 hours of prep for anybody. There typically are no slides. People typically show what they have to demonstrate. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, you guys can see my whiteboard, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Here, whole team participates, and whoever has created the work product needs to show it to the stakeholders, product owner, and the whole team. Basically, sometimes you are working alone in the team, and then sometimes you do not know what other people were working on. Even if the whole teams are working together to achieve one objective, the user stories are different. That's why what is accomplished in that user story is typically discussed in this meeting. So here, customers can be part of this. Most of the times they are. The business stakeholders are part of this, and they ask questions and provide feedback. So as soon as the feedback is provided, what happens? What is done with this feedback? Anyone? What should be done with this feedback? If there is a login screen design feature, and there is user ID and there is password, there is submit button, but there is no cancel button, and customer says that I need that cancel button implemented. So what happens to that feedback? Anyone?
And that enhancement we add in the next sprint.
Very good. So this feedback becomes part of your product backlog because it needs to be prioritized. You are close. It becomes part of product backlog, not sprint backlog, because it needs to be prioritized. Agar customer ka feedback aata hai, then it still stays in product backlog, which needs to be prioritized and then put into sprint plan. Because unless it is prioritized by product owner for the importance, it cannot get into sprint backlog. So that's what happens in sprint review meetings. Typically, you demonstrate your accomplishment, you demo what you have done, and then take feedback from the team or stakeholders. Any questions here on demo? All right, let's talk about next one, sprint retrospective. Anyone who has done this earlier can speak about this meeting. What happens in sprint retrospective?
We discuss in this sprint what went well, what can be improved, and there are some big points for that.
Right. What went well? It can be also into different context as well. People take it into whatever way they want to do it. So what went well? What can be improved? Ooh, what was that? And what can we stop doing, right? Here as well, these same questions are answered or asked in different manner. What can we start doing? What can we stop doing? And what can we continue to do? As whole team is working in collaborative environment, it is bound to happen that there are some feedbacks on something that should be done in certain way. The process is reviewed, whether the development process is working fine or not. Okay, QAs always complain that we are getting builds on this in the second week, and that too on Wednesday when everything is done. That's not done. We should be getting builds as soon as developer is done with his user story. Typically, developers work on 2-3 stories together or one story at a time. Which method is more productive? Working on one story at a time, Because when you do that, you will keep burning your user stories and then giving it to tester for testing. That is the more agile and more adopted method to do it. But sometimes what happens is, as we have tendency to slack, we do not work on that user story for about 2 3 days, and then we start on that, and then happily then next second week of the sprint typically is where the work happens, and then testers start getting the user story. If this process not working, then you have to tell it into your sprint retrospective. As a tester, make sure that you're vocal into this meeting. So what is not happening well, or what is not working well? What can we start doing and what can we stop doing? Should be discussed in this meeting. This is also typically 15 to 30 minutes meeting. And it is done after you are done with your sprint. Here, whole team participates, Scrum Master, product owner, the team, and also sometimes customer or business stakeholder can also be part of this, and give inputs on what needs to be changed in the process. It can be a very superficial meeting sometimes. I mean, everybody speaks, right? So you can take inputs from everyone. There are sometimes shared dashboards, shared websites where you can actually put the details of what can be done and what cannot be done is shared, from where you can take your inputs and process the feedback and use it in your next sprint. Now, this is about the sprint retrospective. Here, sometimes very heated discussions happen. You need to be prepared for that, but sometimes they are very calm. Team is, as you start getting into a team environment from norming, storming, performing. In performing stage, then you become more collaborative and start gelling with the team. Then everybody understands what everybody's point of view. Understood. So these are the 3 meetings, or 4 meetings, I would say. We have the grooming meeting, sprint planning meeting, the daily stand-up or daily scrum meeting. We have sprint review meeting and retrospective meeting. Any questions on the ceremonies or meetings? None? Okay, let's talk briefly about what are the artifacts. Okay, so artifacts are, even Scrum Alliance has asked every Scrum team to create few artifacts. We have already talked about product backlog, right? We have already talked about the sprint backlog. Everybody understood that, right? There is one more, which is, these are the 3 recommended by Scrum Alliance or mentioned in Agile, but it is not, binding on any team to use it. This is just a direction. So, and third is burn down charts. So what are burn down charts? So basically it is a representation of your sprint on day-to-day basis. There is day 1, day 2, 3, 4, 5, up till let's say 10. And here it shows how many user story points are there. Let's say 65 is what you have taken. On day 2, let's say you burned 3 user story points, so we are left with 62. Day 3, you have another 3 user story points, so we are at 59. So this represents your burn down of how many user story points you have completed in that day. Typically, it should be like this, right? So it should be going down. But is it like this? Whoever is working in Scrum can tell me their burn down charts. How does it really happen? So these are days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is how really happens. You don't have any burn in 5 days because there is no story closed. Unless developer gives the story to developer and tester on, let's say, second or third day, there is no burn happening. So typically it is like this until maybe 6th or 7th day, and then everything starts burning. Right? This is how typical burn down chart happens. This is where, and some of you who have been working in Scrum Agile teams can vouch for that. This is where your role as tester come into picture. This is where you have to shout about. This is where you have to tell your team that we're not burning our user story points because I am not getting my story for testing until, let's say, Wednesday or Thursday of the second sprint. And this is, you need to tell your team that I need user story, 3-point user story or 1-point user story completed on first or second day. I need to get this first user story for testing. Then I need to be getting second by third day, fourth by this day, so that I can keep burning and keep testing, right? Otherwise, what are you going to do in first 2-3 days? This question is also important for a tester because if the stories are coming late in the game for them to test, they will have lot of stressful period in this span. Last 3-4 days or 5 days are very stressful for QAs and testers because they will be testing day in and day out to close that story, and then Scrum Master will be behind them to get the stories done faster. But to address this question as well, what are you going to do in first 2 days? Either you can spend your time understanding what is coming down the pipe, or you can work on test automation, which is more productive use of your time. Typically, test automation is adopted in most of the Scrum teams because we would like to have faster deliveries. And for that, you need to make sure that you have automated regression test or smoke test for making sure that the build is um, um, ready for further testing. Most of the times, testing team in Scrum teams are doing exploratory testing only. They do not write a lot of big manual test cases. They do exploratory testing, and other time they will be doing automation testing. Got it? Any question on the artifacts? We saw 3 artifacts: product backlog, sprint backlog, and burn down charts. There are burn up charts as well. There is velocity as well that we spoke about in the initial discussion in sprint planning. That's where uh, we actually put that into our sprint backlog, all the stories, and then decide our sprint velocity. Typically, after burn down chart is concluded, or the sprint is concluded, we verify whether we have done, how much work we have done against planned. So let's say out of 65 user stories, we have only completed 40, right, in first sprint. Next sprint, we again take like 50 user story points because we burnt like only 40 and we achieve like all of them, right? Then we increase that size to again 60 and see if we can cross that, and then we accomplish 55. So this keeps growing as team creates more and more work and become more comfortable. Clear so far? Any questions, anyone? I mean, we're at the end of our session of the Scrum and Agile fundamentals. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now. We're 6 minutes over in this session, but I believe that is for good. Now, I have a question for anyone who wants to answer this. What is a tester's role and how does it change from traditional waterfall model? When you're working in Scrum model, how should you change your testing strategy or behavior, or how should you adapt to Scrum? Anyone? Okay, I must call out the names now. Apurva, can you answer? Okay, Apurva may not be able to unmute. How about Bhakti?
Tester should not wait for a complete task to means entire task to complete.
Right.
It should test at every step.
Correct.
Uh, so it will minimize delay or time lag.
Exactly. Very good point. So testers should not wait for everything to be baked. I mean, normally, if you have seen what shift left means, people tend to test early on, right? So they tend to test as soon as it is done or even before it is done. So in shift left approach, your testing curves starts here rather than starting here when is actually developed. So rather than doing it here, you need to test your design as well and requirement as well. So whatever is ready, even if it is partially built, you can start testing there. So start shifting left and test continuously to create that value. Okay, what else is important for testers to consider when they are working in Scrum environment? Veena, do you have anything to contribute?
Mm, I understand like this burn chart model is looks like similar to effort analysis in waterfall model.
Correct, correct, correct. Yeah, but here you discuss and then take feedback onto it, because in every retrospective you are going to look at your burn down chart. How does it look? What went well and why did it look like this? And take feedback and try to improve into next sprint, right? Because then you can hold your developers accountable to give me build on second or third day. But in waterfall models,
Yeah.
that flexibility.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else? Anyone? Harish?
No, sir. I understood well.
Okay. Sridhar, you have anything? Any question from your side?
So like how to achieve in sprint automation and what are the precautions we need to take to deliver a successful in sprint automation?
Yeah, very good question. So if we are doing automation and you are asked to do in sprint automation, which typically takes a little more discipline, because if you have, let's say this is your sprint 1, and 2 and 3, all of the stories that you are going to be delivering here, you won't be able to complete automation for all of them. Whether it is UI automation or API automation, at least, I mean, what I have seen is 50% of the user stories get into next sprint for at least automation. Okay. So then you have, as I mentioned, first initial 2-3 days, you do not have anything to work on. In those days, you can pick up those user story automation. In sprint, user test automation is only achievable if you're using either TDD or BDD models, right? Where you are writing your feature files in advance, you know how the UI is going to look like. You are even writing step definitions, right? Some pseudo code for steps and your page files well in advance. Only then having in sprint automation, can be achieved close to 80%, I would say. But most of the times, even this does not work because your user story themselves spill into next sprint, right? You do not receive build until the last day of your sprint, then you cannot achieve that in sprint automation. So typically what most of the teams do is they either do not add 100% automation as their sprint acceptance criteria or the definition of done. They try to do it fluidly by doing whatever they can achieve in this sprint and rest they can do at the start of next sprint. Most of the times only smoke or acceptance tests are automated in this fashion. If you are working on a big rigorous and regression test cases are only possible to be automated 100% if they are limited in nature, not exhaustive. You can target to complete 100% smoke test and maybe 80 to 90% of your acceptance test cases, but do not take on 100% or commit on automating 100% of the UI test cases. Also, one smaller concept here is about what to automate, right? So typically in Scrum Agile methodology, it is advisable to build up from the ground, which your ground is your unit test, right? These are the most automated tests, most of the time they are. And then you can automate your API test, and then you can automate your UI test. Do not start here. Typically, that's where we do lot of mistakes. We start on automating UI, then we start on API, and then we don't hold developers accountable for this major chunk where the defects can be actually prevented. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Sir, is tester is involved in developing the unit test? I think.
Okay, that is a very good question again, Sridhar. Thank you for asking that. Unit test can be done by developer and can be done by tester as well. It is mostly said in interview answers that unit testing is developer's responsibility. I really do not like that idea because testers can also code, right? If you can code for a test automation in API layer or in UI layer, you can definitely code for unit test as well. If you understand the architecture of your project, how is the UI developed, how are the APIs created, what is MVC model, what are each of these keywords stand for, model, view, controller, how can you test controller, how can you create mock test for testing controller and methods inside that, I think you can gradually learn how to unit test a method or a function. If your development team is creating very modular architecture and their function size is not very complex or method size is not very complex, typically a tester should be also able to test or create unit tests. That's where actually you can put value add, and that approach is called shift left. So if you are doing, or shift up, I would say, if you are doing UI automation, you should try to learn what is API automation. And then if you know what is API automation, you should try how to do unit testing as well. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Any other question, anyone? All right. So this was our first session. Hope you liked it. And sorry, I couldn't come up with any slides because I do not like it. If you insist on slides, I can start creating slides as well. Do you like this approach, or would you rather prefer slides?